What if I told you that one of the most genetically gifted wrestlers in history was on the verge of becoming WWE champion, only to have his career destroyed by a single backstage decision? This is the story of how Scott Steiner went from being one of WCW's biggest stars to a forgotten mid-carder overnight. Scott Carl Rex Steiner was born on July 29, 1962, in Bay City, Michigan, into a working-class German-American family that valued hard work and discipline above everything else. His father worked blue-collar jobs to support the family, and his mother made sure Scott and his brother Rick understood that success came through dedication and sweat. The Rex Steiner household wasn't wealthy, but it was structured. There were rules to follow and expectations to meet. Scott's high school years at Bay City Western showed a kid who had it all figured out. He dominated in both wrestling and football, showing the kind of natural athleticism that coaches dream about finding. On the wrestling mat, Scott was technically sound and physically imposing for his age. He understood leverage and positioning in ways that separated him from other high school wrestlers. His football coaches loved his intensity and work ethic. Scott played multiple positions and never complained about the workload. He was the type of athlete who made everyone around him better just by showing up ready to compete every single day. Even back then, there were signs of the intensity that would later consume him. Teammates remember Scott as someone who never knew when to quit. After regular practice ended, Scott would stay behind to work on specific moves or conditioning drills, pushing his body to limits that worried his coaches. His high school wrestling coach once had to physically remove Scott from the wrestling room because he refused to stop training after a particularly grueling practice session. The drive that impressed his coaches also concerned them at times. Scott would get visibly frustrated when he lost matches or didn't execute techniques perfectly, taking losses personally in ways that seemed unhealthy for a teenager. At the University of Michigan from 1983 to 1986, Scott took his athletic abilities to the next level. He became an NCAA Division I All-American wrestler. He placed 6th nationally in 1986 and was a 3-time Big Ten runner-up. This achievement put Scott among the elite college wrestlers in the country. The competition at Michigan was intense, with wrestlers from across the nation competing for starting positions. Scott not only earned his spot on the team but became one of their best performers. Scott served as team captain during his time at Michigan, which demonstrated leadership qualities that his coaches recognized. Being captain of a Division I wrestling team requires more than just athletic ability. You have to motivate teammates, represent the program, and handle the pressure that comes with being the face of the team. Scott's teammates respected his work ethic and his results on the mat. He led by example, showing up early for practice and staying late to work on technique. His coaches trusted him to help younger wrestlers develop their skills and understand what it took to compete at the highest levels. While excelling athletically, Scott was also earning education credits, eyeing a teaching career before pro wrestling called. This career path was a far cry from the big Poppa Pump character he'd later become. Scott was serious about his studies and maintained good grades despite the demanding schedule of being a Division I athlete. He understood that wrestling wouldn't last forever and wanted to have a stable career after his competitive days ended. The idea of Scott Steiner as a high school teacher seems impossible now, but that was genuinely his plan during college. The transformation from future teacher to professional wrestler started when Scott and his brother Rick began planning their move into professional wrestling during their college years. Rick had already shown interest in the wrestling business, and Scott initially wasn't sure about following that path. But as his amateur wrestling career wound down, Scott started considering the possibility of turning professional. The brothers began researching the wrestling business and making contacts with people who could help them get started. Scott's early wrestling training began with Dr. Jerry Graham Jr. in Toledo, Ohio, who provided him with the foundational skills needed to succeed in professional wrestling. This training focused on performance psychology and in-ring storytelling, showing Scott the shift from amateur to pro style. Professional wrestling required him to learn how to work with opponents instead of against them, how to tell stories through matches, and how to connect with audiences. Scott's amateur background gave him legitimate athletic credibility, but he had to learn an entirely new set of skills to succeed as a professional wrestler. The combination of Scott's NCAA All-American status and his academic background created a unique foundation for his wrestling career. He had legitimate athletic credentials that set him apart from wrestlers who were purely entertainers. At the same time, his education studies showed he could think strategically and understand complex concepts. This clean-cut academic achiever was about to enter a world that would completely change who he was as a person. What Scott and Rick were building together would soon shake up the entire wrestling industry. The brothers entered professional wrestling in 1986 and revolutionized what tag team wrestling could be. When Scott and Rick started out, they struggled at first, working small independent shows and learning the business the hard way. The transition from amateur wrestling to professional wrestling wasn't easy for either brother. They had to learn how to work with opponents instead of against them. They had to understand crowd psychology and how to tell stories through their matches. Most importantly, they had to develop a style that would make them stand out from all the other tag teams trying to make it in the business. The early days were tough for the Steiner brothers. They worked shows in small towns for very little money. Sometimes they'd drive hours to wrestle in front of 50 people in a high school gym. But these experiences taught them valuable lessons about the wrestling business. They learned how to connect with audiences and how to work different styles of matches. Scott's amateur wrestling background helped him understand the technical aspects of the business, but he still had to learn how to make everything look exciting for the crowd. But by 1988, something clicked. They developed a hard-hitting, athletic style that no other tag team could match. The Steiner brothers combined Scott's technical skills with Rick's raw power to create something completely new. Their matches were stiffer than most tag team contests. They hit harder and moved faster than teams that had been wrestling for years. Scott brought legitimate wrestling credentials to their matches, while Rick provided the intensity and aggression that made their offense look devastating. Scott innovated moves that are still used today, including the Frankensteiner in the late 1980s. His Frankensteiner Hurricane Rana became an instant highlight. The move showed off his incredible athleticism as he would leap onto an opponent's shoulders and flip them backward in a Hurricane Rana-style move that looked impossible when done correctly. Very few wrestlers had the combination of strength, balance, and timing needed to execute the move safely. Scott made it look easy, but it required years of practice to perfect. The move became so associated with Scott that other wrestlers would try to copy it without understanding the mechanics. Most failed attempts looked awkward or dangerous. Scott's version was smooth and impactful every time. The Frankensteiner became a highlight reel move that crowds expected to see in every Steiner Brothers match. It also established Scott as an innovator who could create moves that other wrestlers would spend years trying to master. Their matches against teams like the Road Warriors and Doom became instant classics, with Scott's technical skills perfectly complementing Rick's raw power. The Road Warriors were considered the most dominant tag team in wrestling at the time, but the Steiner brothers proved they could match their intensity with brutal affairs that showcased both teams' physical abilities. The matches with Doom were equally impressive, often going 15 to 20 minutes and telling complete stories from start to finish. From 1988 to 1995, they dominated everywhere they went. WCW, WWF, New Japan Pro Wrestling, even ECW couldn't get enough of them. The Steiner brothers captured their first major championship when they defeated the Fabulous Freebirds for the NWA WCW World Tag Team titles on November 1, 1989. This victory established them as legitimate championship contenders and marked the beginning of their championship dominance across multiple promotions. Their success in WCW led to opportunities in other promotions. They won the IWGP Tag Team Championship in New Japan Pro Wrestling, which showed they could adapt their style to different wrestling cultures. Japanese fans appreciated their technical skills and hard-hitting approach. The Steiners' matches in Japan were often given more time than American matches, allowing them to showcase their full range of abilities. The WWF run from 1992 to 1994 brought them to national television on a regular basis. They appeared on the first episode of Monday Night Raw and quickly established themselves as top contenders in the WWF's tag team division. They won the WWF Tag Team Championship twice during their run, proving they could succeed in the WWF's sports entertainment environment, as well as WCW's more athletic presentation. They won championships across multiple promotions and were recognized as the most athletic tag team in wrestling history. Wrestling magazines regularly ranked them as the best tag team in the world during their peak years. Their combination of legitimate athletic credentials and entertaining matches made them favorites with both fans and wrestling journalists. They could work technical matches that satisfied hardcore wrestling fans and exciting brawls that entertained casual viewers. Scott's work during this period showed a wrestler at the peak of his technical abilities, executing complex moves with perfect precision. His amateur wrestling background was evident in every match he worked. He understood leverage and positioning better than most professional wrestlers. His transitions between moves were smooth and logical. Scott made difficult moves look effortless, while other wrestlers struggled with basic techniques. The Steiner Brothers had reached the top of the wrestling world, but success would soon become Scott's biggest problem. By the mid-1990s, the pressures of being wrestling's premier tag team were starting to create cracks that would eventually destroy everything they had built together. What nobody realized was that Scott's personality was already starting to change in ways that went far beyond normal career evolution. By 1995, people close to Scott Steiner started noticing changes that went way beyond normal career evolution. Scott began showing a more aggressive attitude toward opponents and even toward his own brother Rick during matches and backstage. The shift wasn't subtle either. Fellow wrestlers who had known Scott for years started seeing a different person entirely. Where he used to be professional and focused on the business side of wrestling, Scott was becoming more confrontational and personal about everything that happened in the ring. The most obvious change was physical. Scott became obsessed with bodybuilding and started adding serious muscle mass to his frame. By 95, he was living in the gym, chasing mass at the expense of his earlier agility. This wasn't just normal conditioning that wrestlers do to stay in shape. Scott was spending hours in the gym every day, focusing specifically on building size rather than just maintaining his athletic ability. The transformation was happening so fast that people who hadn't seen him for a few weeks would do double takes when they saw him again. Scott's training regimen became something completely different from what he'd done during his amateur wrestling days. He was following bodybuilding routines designed to pack on mass, not the functional strength training that had made him such an effective wrestler. The change in his physique was obvious to everyone who saw him, but what worried people more was how consumed he was becoming with the process. Scott would talk constantly about his workouts, his diet, and his progress in building muscle. But the real warning signs were behavioral. He started having backstage disagreements about creative direction and questioned booking decisions more aggressively. Scott had always been professional about taking direction from bookers and working whatever storylines they gave him. That started changing in 1995. He began questioning why certain matches were booked the way they were. He wanted to know why the Steiner brothers weren't getting better storylines or more prominent positions on shows. These weren't casual questions either. Scott was becoming confrontational about booking decisions he didn't like. The discussions backstage weren't friendly conversations about creative direction. Scott was becoming more demanding and less willing to accept explanations from bookers and producers. He started pushing for changes to storylines and match finishes, and people in management positions found themselves having to deal with Scott's complaints and demands on a regular basis. His off-screen intensity was rising in ways that went beyond normal backstage politics. By 1996, Scott's suspended license arrest showed how his real-world behavior was becoming as volatile as his backstage outbursts. Fellow wrestlers noticed that Scott's attitude toward the business was shifting from professional to personal, and his unpredictable reactions were making him harder to work with in any situation. His relationship with Rick became strained as Scott pushed for more individual recognition and grew frustrated with their tag team limitations. The Steiner brothers had been incredibly successful as a team, but Scott was starting to feel held back by the tag team format. He wanted singles matches and individual storylines that would showcase his abilities without having to share the spotlight with Rick. These conversations between the brothers weren't always friendly, and people backstage could sense tension between them that hadn't existed before. Scott started expressing frustration about being limited to tag team wrestling when he felt capable of succeeding as a singles wrestler. He'd point to other wrestlers who had transitioned from tag teams to successful singles careers and wonder why the Steiner brothers weren't being given similar opportunities. Rick was more content with their tag team success, which created friction between them about the direction of their careers. The intense training regimen Scott adopted wasn't just about getting stronger. It was becoming an obsession that consumed his free time. People who knew Scott outside of wrestling noticed that he had less time for anything that wasn't related to bodybuilding or wrestling. His entire schedule revolved around training, eating to support his muscle growth, and recovering from workouts. This level of dedication went beyond what was necessary for professional wrestling and entered territory that seemed unhealthy. Scott's obsession with building muscle was taking over other aspects of his life. He would schedule social activities around his training schedule. He'd turn down invitations to events if they conflicted with his gym time. The physical transformation was impressive, but the single-minded focus on bodybuilding was concerning to people who cared about him. People in the locker room started walking on eggshells around Scott, unsure which version of him they'd encounter on any given day. The unpredictability of Scott's moods was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere backstage. Wrestlers who had been friends with Scott for years found themselves being more careful about what they said around them. Nobody wanted to accidentally set him off or get into a confrontation with someone who was becoming increasingly volatile. These warning signs were building towards something that would change everything Scott had worked for. All the frustration, obsession, and growing resentment were about to explode in a way that would destroy relationships and create a character nobody saw coming. In 1998, Scott Steiner did something that still shocks fans who watch it back. He completely destroyed everything he'd built with his brother. The heel turn wasn't just a storyline decision. It was Scott channeling his real-life frustrations into a character that let him express his darkest impulses. All those personality changes we saw building up over the previous years were about to explode onto television screens across the country. Scott had been looking for a way to break out as a singles wrestler, and turning heel gave him the perfect opportunity to do it. The transformation started with Scott's physical appearance. He packed on even more muscle mass and grew a goatee that made him look more intimidating. Then came the bleached blonde hair and beard that became his trademark look. This wasn't just a simple dye job either. Scott went platinum blonde in a way that made him stand out from every other wrestler on the roster. The new look was striking and impossible to ignore. Combined with his already massive physique, Scott looked like a completely different person from the clean-cut amateur wrestler he'd been just a few years earlier. The betrayal of Rick happened on February 22, 1998, during a tag team title match against the Outsiders at Super Brawl 8. Scott turned on his brother during the match, ending the Steiner Brothers as a tag team once and for all. But this wasn't just acted. The intensity of Scott's performance made it clear that he was drawing from genuine emotions. The split wasn't just about storylines. It was Scott finally expressing the frustration he'd been feeling about being stuck in a tag team when he wanted to be a singles star. The next night on Nitro, Scott debuted his full transformation. He bleached his beard, donned chainmail, and turned every ring walk into a muscle pageant. The aftermath of the betrayal was brutal to watch. Scott attacked Rick with a viciousness that seemed to go beyond what the storyline required. Their confrontations had an edge that made fans uncomfortable because it felt too real. Scott's promos about Rick were personal and mean-spirited in ways that suggested he was working through actual family issues on television. The brothers had been close for their entire careers, but Scott's transformation was destroying that relationship, both on screen and behind the scenes. Scott's new Big Poppa Pump character was inspired by superstar Billy Graham, but Scott took it to places Graham never went. Graham had been known for his physique and his colorful promos, but Scott added elements that were much more sexually explicit. This focus on his physical appearance and the sexually charged persona pushed the boundaries of what WCW would allow, making him a controversial figure who was impossible to ignore. Scott joined the NWO Wolfpack during this transformation, which became the key platform for developing his solo persona. The NWO was the hottest storyline in wrestling at the time, and joining them gave Scott immediate credibility as a main event player. His membership in the group also gave him opportunities to cut more promos and showcase his new character. The Wolfpack affiliation allowed Big Poppa Pump to grow from simple heel turn into a fully realized character with attitude and backing. The flexing routine and steroid-enhanced physique became his calling cards, but they also became his prison. Scott was now trapped in a character that required him to maintain an impossible physical standard. He had to keep getting bigger and more muscular to maintain the image he'd created. This meant more time in the gym, more focus on his physique, and less attention paid to his actual wrestling skills. The character was successful, but it was also limiting Scott's ability to be a well-rounded performer. Scott's promos during this period were rambling and often incoherent, but they had an intensity that made them impossible to ignore. He would go off on tangents that didn't make logical sense, but his delivery was so passionate that fans couldn't look away. Scott mixed mathematics with sexual bragging in ways that defied logic, creating some of the most memorable and quotable promos in wrestling history. These promos were often difficult to follow, but they were undeniably entertaining. The mathematical elements of Scott's promos became legendary among wrestling fans. He would calculate percentages and odds in ways that didn't add up mathematically, but his confidence in delivering these calculations made them compelling television. Scott would claim to have a certain percentage chance of winning matches based on his superior genetics and training. These promos were nonsensical, but they were delivered with such conviction that they became part of wrestling folklore. The success of the character was immediate. Scott became a memorable figure in WCW and eventually became the interim leader of NWO Hollywood during Hulk Hogan's absence. The transformation allowed Scott to break out as a singles wrestler and eventually win the WCW Championship in 2000. From a career perspective, the Big Poppa Pump character was exactly what Scott needed to reach the next level. Big Poppa Pump wasn't just a character. It was Scott Steiner unleashing parts of his personality that he'd kept hidden for years. But as successful as the character became, it also revealed how Scott's relationship with reality was becoming increasingly strained. His promos were getting stranger, his behavior more unpredictable, and his ability to separate character from reality was disappearing entirely. The Steiner math promo wasn't just a one-off moment. It was the perfect example of how Scott's mind was working during his WCW peak. By 1999 and 2000, Scott had developed this weird habit of incorporating mathematical calculations into his promos that made absolutely no sense when you actually tried to follow the logic. At Fall Brawl 2000, Scott calculated a 141 2/3% chance to win, a line WCW fans still quote today. He stood there and factored in Kurt Angle's chances and referenced various insiders, concluding with complete confidence in numbers that were mathematically impossible but delivered with total conviction. Scott's feuds during this period became legendary, but not always for the right reasons. The Diamond Dallas Page storyline was built around Scott's obsession with Page's wife Kimberly, with Scott making crude comments about her during promos that pushed the boundaries of what WCW would allow on television. The storyline was controversial and uncomfortable, but it generated genuine heat for Scott's character. This was the same period when Scott's real-world volatility was escalating, like his November 28, 1998 incident with a Department of Transportation worker in Atlanta that made the newspapers. The line between his character's aggression and his actual behavior was disappearing completely. His Best of 7 series with Booker T showed flashes of his old technical brilliance, but it was overshadowed by his increasingly erratic behavior. The series took place in 2006 when both men were past their physical primes, but they still managed to put together some solid matches. Scott's technical skills were still there when he wanted to use them. He could chain wrestle and execute complex moves when he focused on the wrestling instead of the character work. But too often during this series, Scott would go off script or add elements that weren't part of the planned match. Backstage, Scott had become a walking powder keg that management couldn't control. His conflicts with Vince Russo turned into real confrontations that affected entire storylines, with Scott refusing segments he felt made him look weak. WCW had to deal with filming suspensions when Scott wouldn't cooperate, and there were incidents like the Nature Boy parking lot chase that showed just how volatile he'd become. Fellow wrestlers were genuinely intimidated by Scott's steroid-enhanced physique. When he got angry about something, his physical presence made every disagreement feel potentially dangerous. Nobody knew what would set Scott off or how he'd react to criticism, creating an atmosphere where people walked on eggshells around him. Creative control became Scott's obsession, and he'd refuse to do storylines that he felt made him look weak or stupid. Scott had developed very specific ideas about how his character should be presented. He wanted to look strong and dominant in every situation. If a storyline called for him to lose a match or look foolish, Scott would push back against it. He felt that his character's credibility was more important than whatever story the writers were trying to tell. This desire for creative control created constant friction with the writing team. Scott would demand changes to scripts and storylines right up until showtime. Sometimes he'd refuse to do segments that had already been written and rehearsed. This made it extremely difficult for WCW to use Scott in complex storylines because they never knew if he'd actually follow through with what they'd planned. The intimidation wasn't just about Scott's size, it was also about his unpredictable personality. Some wrestlers would avoid confronting Scott about anything because they didn't want to deal with the potential consequences. This dynamic made Scott difficult to work with and created problems for anyone who had to collaborate with him on storylines or matches. Other wrestlers would have to pick sides or try to stay neutral when Scott and management were having problems. Scott had become the most unpredictable performer in WCW, which made him compelling television but impossible to work with. His mathematical promos were quotable and his feuds generated heat, but behind the scenes, he was burning bridges with everyone from management to fellow wrestlers. The same intensity that made Big Poppa Pump a memorable character was making Scott Steiner unemployable. When WCW folded in 2001, Scott's reputation preceded him. Every major promotion knew about his backstage issues, his creative demands, and his volatile personality. The question wasn't whether Scott could still wrestle. It was whether anyone would be willing to deal with everything that came with hiring him. WWE finally took a chance on Scott in November 2002, but his WCW swagger met WWE's tight scripts, and it stumbled. The crowd at Madison Square Garden went crazy when Scott interrupted Matt Hardy and Chris Nowinski during the Survivor Series. He took both guys down with clotheslines and suplexes that reminded everyone why they'd missed him. Both Raw and SmackDown wanted to sign him, and Eric Bischoff won the bidding war to bring Scott to Raw. The initial buzz was huge. WWE had one of WCW's biggest stars back, and everyone thought this was going to be Scott's chance to prove he belonged in the main event. WWE's corporate environment was completely different from WCW's chaos, and Scott couldn't adapt to their structured approach. WCW had let Scott do whatever he wanted during his Big Poppa Pump run. He could cut unscripted promos and change storylines on the fly. WWE didn't work that way. They had writers who planned everything in advance. They had corporate executives who approved every segment. Scott was used to having creative control over his character, but WWE wanted him to follow their scripts and their vision for what Big Poppa Pump should be. The culture clash was obvious from the start. WWE officials expected Scott to show up on time, follow directions, and work within their system. Scott had spent years in WCW doing things his own way. He wasn't used to being told exactly what to say or how to present his character. The structured approach that worked for other WWE wrestlers felt restrictive to someone who'd been given free rein for so long. His feuds with Triple H and Test were supposed to establish him as a main event player, but something was clearly wrong. WWE immediately put Scott in a program with Triple H, who was the World Heavyweight Champion at the time. This should have been a dream feud between two of wrestling's biggest stars. Instead, WWE reduced it to segments like their arm wrestling and bench press competition combo that completely missed what made Scott's character work. The whole thing became about who had bigger muscles instead of building a compelling storyline. The approach completely missed what made Scott's character work in WCW. Big Poppa Pump wasn't just about muscles. He was unpredictable and dangerous. WWE turned him into a generic musclehead who flexed and posed, but didn't have the edge that made him interesting. The creative team seemed to think Scott's appeal was purely physical, so they focused on his body instead of his personality. Scott insisted on his signature freestyle math even when WWE writers scripted alternate lines. He wanted to keep doing the math calculations that had made him famous in WCW. WWE's writers tried to give him different material, but Scott would go back to his old formulas during live segments. He'd calculate percentages and odds in ways that didn't make sense, just like he'd done before. The problem was that WWE's audience wasn't as familiar with this character trait, so the promos came across as confusing rather than entertaining. The resistance to creative direction created constant friction between Scott and the writing team. They'd script promos for him, and he'd change them when he got to the ring. This made it impossible for WWE to build consistent storylines around his character. Other wrestlers didn't know what Scott was going to say or do, which made it hard for them to respond appropriately. The matches with Triple H at Royal Rumble and No Way Out were heavily criticized by fans and critics who expected much more. The Royal Rumble match in 2003 was particularly brutal to watch. It went nearly 20 minutes, which was way too long for Scott's physical condition at the time. The Wrestling Observer gave it the award for Worst Wrestling Match of the Year. Fans who had been excited to see Scott back in a major promotion were disappointed by how slow and sloppy the match looked. The No Way Out rematch didn't improve things. Scott lost again, which effectively ended his main event run before it really got started. After two big pay-per-view losses to Triple H, WWE moved Scott down to the mid-card. He wasn't even included on the WrestleMania 19 card, which showed how far he'd fallen in the company's plans. Behind the scenes, Scott was dealing with back problems from years of intense training and steroid use that affected his in-ring performance. His strained cardio and lingering injuries undermined his long matches. His mobility was seriously limited compared to his peak years. The condition was visible during his matches. Scott couldn't execute moves with the same precision he'd shown in WCW. His body, which had been his greatest asset as Big Poppa Pump, was now working against him in WWE's high work rate environment. WWE expected their main event wrestlers to have long matches with complex sequences. Scott's physical limitations made it impossible for him to meet those expectations. The steroid-enhanced physique that had defined his character was creating health problems that prevented him from performing at the level he needed. WWE officials grew frustrated with Scott's resistance to direction and his inability to deliver the matches they needed. The combination of creative conflicts and physical limitations made Scott difficult to work with. Management felt like they'd invested in a main event star, but gotten someone who couldn't adapt to their system. By August 2004, WWE had seen enough. Scott was released after less than 2 years, marking the end of his major promotion career. The WWE run proved that Scott's success in WCW might have been more about the environment than his actual abilities. But Scott's problems weren't going to end with his wrestling career. The same volatility that made him impossible to work with in WWE was about to create much bigger problems outside the ring. Scott's legal troubles began piling up in the 2000s with multiple assault and terroristic threat charges that painted a picture of someone who had completely lost control of his temper and his actions. These weren't minor disputes that got blown out of proportion. These were serious criminal charges that showed Scott's aggressive behavior wasn't limited to his wrestling character. It had become part of who he was in real life. The charges revealed a pattern of violence that extended far beyond the wrestling ring into his everyday interactions with people. One of the most disturbing incidents happened on April 21, 1998, when Scott threatened and struck an Atlanta Department of Transportation worker with his truck. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction during a wrestling show. This was Scott using his vehicle as a weapon against a city employee who was just doing his job. The incident showed how Scott's real-world aggression had reached dangerous levels, where he was willing to use physical violence against complete strangers over minor disagreements. The assault charges and restraining orders painted a picture of someone whose real-life aggression had spiraled completely out of control. Court documents detailed incidents where Scott's behavior crossed the line from heated arguments into physical violence. The restraining orders weren't just temporary measures. They were legal protections that people felt they needed to stay safe around Scott. This was the same man who had once been known for his professionalism and dedication to wrestling. Now he was someone that people in his own life feared. Court appearances became regular occurrences for Scott, and each new legal issue made wrestling promoters more reluctant to book him. Every time Scott's name appeared in the news, it was connected to another arrest or court date. wrestling promoters started viewing Scott as too much of a risk to put on their shows. They worried about negative publicity and potential liability issues. If Scott got arrested again while working for their company, it could damage their reputation and create legal problems for them too. The pattern of legal troubles wasn't just about individual incidents. It was about Scott becoming unreliable as a business partner. Promoters couldn't count on him to show up for events because he might be dealing with court dates or legal issues. They couldn't trust him to behave professionally at their shows because his real-life problems were affecting his ability to separate his personal issues from his work. This made Scott toxic to wrestling companies that needed dependable performers. Scott's confrontational behavior extended beyond legal troubles into shoot interviews and backstage altercations that showed a man who couldn't separate his character from his real personality anymore. The Chester incident where he bid to run over a DOT worker, the EMT assault at Greensboro where he attacked someone he thought was part of a wrestling angle, and his brawl with Diamond Dallas Page all demonstrated that Scott's aggression wasn't confined to scripted storylines. These weren't worked fights designed to build heat. They were real altercations where people got hurt, and Scott's size and strength made every situation potentially dangerous. The EMT incident was particularly telling because Scott was arrested and charged with criminal assault after attacking someone during a WCW television taping. The charges were eventually dropped when it was determined that Scott genuinely believed the EMT was an actor, but the incident showed how completely he had lost the ability to distinguish between wrestling and reality. This was someone who couldn't tell the difference between a real emergency medical technician and a wrestling performer. Industry relationships that had taken years to build were destroyed overnight as promoters decided Scott was too much of a liability. Wrestling is a relationship-based business where trust and reliability are essential. Scott's legal troubles made it impossible for promoters to trust him. They couldn't count on him to show up without creating problems. They couldn't depend on him to behave professionally around other wrestlers and staff members. Years of building connections in the wrestling business were wiped out by Scott's inability to control his behavior. The cumulative impact of Scott's legal issues became clear as major incidents continued piling up. The 2005 airline incident and the 2015 airport threat against Hulk Hogan's wife Jennifer showed that Scott's problems weren't getting better with time. They were getting worse. Each new incident reinforced the perception that Scott was someone wrestling companies couldn't afford to be associated with. The man who had once been a respected NCAA champion was now someone that wrestling companies actively avoided. Scott's legal troubles revealed that the Big Poppa Pump character wasn't just an act. It had become who he really was. The transformation from respected athlete to controversial liability was complete, and the wrestling industry had taken notice. Major promotions had closed their doors to Scott, leaving him to figure out what came next in a career that had spiraled completely out of control. The independent wrestling scene became Scott's new home, though it wasn't quite the wrestling purgatory people expected. His 2006 TNA return at Destination X showed he could still draw for major promotions when they were willing to take the risk. Scott aligned with Jeff Jarrett and feuded with Sting and Samoa Joe, proving that Big Poppa Pump still had value as a special attraction. He even captured the WWA World Heavyweight Championship, showing that smaller promotions were eager to put titles on him for the name recognition alone. But most of Scott's work was on the independent circuit, where promoters knew that booking Big Poppa Pump would put people in seats. The crowds were smaller and the pay was worse than his WCW and WWE days. But Scott still had name recognition that independent promoters couldn't ignore. These smaller promotions needed names that would sell tickets, and Scott's reputation was enough to generate interest even if his in-ring abilities had declined significantly. The internet had given Scott's career a second life in ways he probably never expected. Modern fans who discovered Scott through internet memes embraced both his legitimate wrestling skills and his entertainment value as a spectacle. The Steiner math promo had become legendary online, and younger fans who hadn't seen Scott during his peak were discovering him through YouTube videos and social media clips. His NWA Hall of Fame roast became another viral moment that reminded people why Big Poppa Pump was impossible to ignore. These fans appreciated Scott's absurdity without necessarily understanding the context of his career decline. They saw him as an entertaining character rather than a fallen star. People would attend independent shows specifically to hear Scott cut promos and see if he'd say something quotable. His mathematical calculations and sexual bragging had become part of wrestling folklore. Fans would chant along with his catchphrases and laugh at his outrageous claims about his physical superiority. The contrast between his current appearances and his championship days with Rick created a strange nostalgia among wrestling fans. Older fans who remembered the Steiner Brothers' technical excellence would watch Scott's matches with mixed emotions. They could see flashes of the athlete he used to be, but those moments were overshadowed by his physical limitations and his commitment to the Big Poppa Pump character. The gap between past and present was impossible to ignore. Scott's matches were a far cry from the athletic exhibitions he'd put on during the Steiner Brothers era. His mobility was limited, and he couldn't execute the complex moves that had made him famous, especially after his 2020 heart scare that illustrated the serious health toll his career had taken. Instead, Scott relied on his character work and his intimidating presence to carry matches. The wrestling was secondary to the spectacle of Big Poppa Pump flexing and cutting promos. Scott continued using the Big Poppa Pump character because it was all he had left. The technical wrestler from the Steiner Brothers era was long gone. His body couldn't handle the demands of technical wrestling anymore, but he could still pose and flex and cut bizarre promos. The character had become his identity, and Scott seemed unable or unwilling to develop anything new. He was stuck playing a role that had been created over a decade earlier, even though his physical condition made it increasingly difficult to maintain. The commitment to the character was both admirable and sad to watch. Scott would still do the flexing routine even when his body clearly wasn't what it used to be. He'd still make outrageous claims about his physical superiority even when everyone could see he was past his prime. The dedication to Big Poppa Pump showed Scott's professionalism, but it also highlighted his inability to adapt to his changing circumstances. His relationship with fans became complicated. They cheered for him ironically while also respecting his legitimate athletic achievements. People would cheer when Scott flexed, but it wasn't the same kind of heat he generated during his WCW peak. The cheers were often mocking, with fans enjoying the absurdity rather than being genuinely impressed. At the same time, older fans who remembered Scott's technical skills would show genuine appreciation for his past accomplishments. Independent promoters booked Scott as a special attraction rather than a sustained main event draw. They wanted the name, recognition, and the potential for memorable moments, but they understood his limitations. Instead of being positioned as a main event star, he was treated more like a novelty act. Promoters would use him to generate interest in their shows, but they wouldn't build entire storylines around him. This internet revival led to his 2017 TNA Slam-miversary appearance, and eventually, the 2022 WWE Hall of Fame induction he had previously mocked. When WWE announced that the Steiner Brothers would be inducted, it marked a reconciliation between Scott and the wrestling establishment. Scott had previously called the Hall of Fame honor of zero merits, but he seemed genuinely appreciative when the recognition finally came. Scott's independent career showed a man trying to maintain relevance in a business that had moved past him. The transformation from technical master to meme-worthy character was complete, leaving fans to wonder what might have been if things had gone differently. Scott Steiner's career represents the most extreme transformation in wrestling history, from technical master to polarizing figure whose legacy remains divided between a tag team innovator and a controversial solo act. The guy who started as an NCAA All-American with legitimate athletic credentials ended up as someone wrestling companies wouldn't touch. His legacy is split between the innovative tag team wrestler who changed the business and the steroid-enhanced character who nearly destroyed his life. The Steiner Brothers revolutionized what tag teams could do in the ring. But Big Poppa Pump became a spectacle that overshadowed everything else Scott accomplished. Like and subscribe for 100 Years of Luck. Until next time.